who talk for way too long and go really fast at the end to cram everything in. So I need to start by providing a little disclaimer. Yes.
Hold on. Can you share that screen?
Yes.
I think it's showing.
Oh, it's showing the notes. Yeah. I'm sure we can figure that out somehow. Okay. So I want to share which one of these.
I think you can share that one, and then.
I promise I'm not totally inept at technology. Okay.
Okay. I think it is good.
They're still seeing the.
I think it might be an issue with presentation mode in PowerPoint.
Okay. Can I turn this off somehow?
So they said go first to present and then share.
Okay.
Maybe you stop
sharing.
and then make a present mode. And then if your screen can share.
Oh my gosh, guys. Sorry, this is terrible. Okay. I'm going into presenter mode. And then share?
Yeah. Can you do that?
No.
No. In that case, kind of go the other way. I have another idea. So let's just kind of share your presentation.
Mm.
And then we may kind of swap the screen. That's the one possibility.
Okay. Actually, let me see if this will do it. There. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So I think. Okay. Everyone's. Okay. Perfect.
Everybody,
All right. Sorry about that. So. Yeah. So as I mentioned, with the EPA, and I'm talking to you about designing equitable governance systems to improve socio-environmental outcomes. Now I can't get this thing. Oh, there we go. Now I can't change my slides. Yikes. All right.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Hopefully that will work. So I need to start with a slight disclaimer that the views I'm expressing are not on behalf of the EPA. They are my own views and my own opinions based on my own perceptions and how I live my life. So, okay. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of my life path that got me to where I am today. I'm going to go through some definitions and framing for what informs the research that I do. And then I'm finally going to dive into some research case studies and then end up with questions. So how did we get here? So I am from Pennsylvania, very rural place in Bucks County, which is this red little county that you see on here. And so I did my undergraduate degree in environmental science. I was very focused on aquatics and specifically the use of submerged aquatic vegetation as a bioindicator of stream health. I went from that and a number of internships with different state environmental organizations to the US EPA in Washington, D.C., which is where the headquarters is located. And so I was hired there as an ORISE, which is Oak Ridge Institute of Science and Education. I worked in communications and outreach, which at that time, the watershed approach was the new big thing. Okay, so that dates me a little bit. So I went from that position working in the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, or OWAL, eventually got hired as a full-time Fed in drinking water protection, and then was hired later on back in OWAL to work on the non-point source pollution control program. While I was doing that and sort of dipping my feet in policy making and policy implementation and everything that goes along with creating new guidance and guidelines for states and organizations. I did a master's degree at Johns Hopkins in environmental planning and management. I now teach climate change there since 2019. I then did my PhD at UC Davis, where I really tried to tie my undergrad background in biophysical sciences with my policymaking experience with an advisor that studies social ecological systems. That's Dr. Mark LaBelle at UC Davis. And then I ended up a postdoc at the Twin Cities and then ultimately up here in Duluth. And I'll talk a little bit about those jobs later. So I started with this title of designing equitable governance systems to improve socio-environmental outcomes. How many people could tell me what that actually means? Yeah. So we're going to break it down. So governance. Governance is essentially a complex system of decision-making processes, okay? So we've got people. That might be individuals or communities or a class, for example. And then we have things called norms. So for example, when you came in here today, you chose somewhere to sit. How did you choose where to sit? Maybe you sat there before. Maybe there's some other reason you can't see the screen or you don't want to be up front, right? There are these norms that aren't specific formal rules that we still follow. And then we have more informal policies or rules or laws, like the Clean Water Act or grading schemes, right? So you have to do X, Y, Z to get an A in the class. You might also have a chore wheel. So if you have roommates, which I realize we're grad students, so maybe you don't have roommates, but chances are you can remember a time when you did have roommates. Maybe you had a chore wheel, maybe you didn't. All of these things interact together to create some decision outcome. So that might influence your decision on whether to move into a house with roommates or not. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about governance, is that process. So then what is equitable governance? So equitable governance is defined in a lot of different ways. The one that I try to draw on is fair and just, and literature specifically from environmental justice scholarship. So fair treatment. No group of people should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. That would be fair treatment. Meaningful involvement then is how we get to the just process. So there should be an opportunity for people to participate in decisions that might influence them. Those contributions that people provide should actually be able to influence the decisions themselves. And then finally, decision makers, the onus should be on them to seek out those that might be affected, to involve them in that decision process. And then finally, socio-environmental outcomes. So we can think about, typical environmental outcomes. Here's just a couple examples on here, right? So improving water quality, restoring habitat, maybe natural resources themselves, if we think about timber. And then there are social outcomes. So well-being, health, income, things like empowerment or education. As a social ecological scientist, I do all of my work around the central idea that there is an inherent connection between social and environmental systems that we cannot ignore. So when we put this all together, if decision processes, governance systems, related to environmental challenges are fair and just, equitable, the outcome will be improved environmental quality and improved human well-being. So improved socio-environmental outcomes. So that is what I'm talking to you about today. All right, so very quickly, some theory. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but just to talk a little bit to give you some examples of how I sort of view the research that I do. One is what's called the social ecological systems framework. Have any of you seen this before? No. Okay. So this one that I'm citing here is by Elinor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Huge deal in political science. So she basically proved tragedy of the commons to be false. So the social ecological systems, similar to what I was just talking about, this intertwined nature. We have environmental sort of resource systems, and then we have the people side. And those two systems interact to develop some outcome. And that's how I understand a system, is by looking at the whole. Important in this framework is that it doesn't operate in a vacuum. In order to understand a system, we need to look at systems that are connected to it And we need to look at things like the social, economic, and political settings that will shape that system. So with that lens on going into a system and trying to understand it, I also draw on collaborative governance. This is an example of a collaborative governance framework. It is not the only one. There are many of them. This is just one that's cited a lot by Emerson et al. And so essentially my argument is that to solve an environmental challenge, we need to look at and bring together people from different sectors and different perspectives on this system. We then need them to work together, so collaborate in some way. So they might have some shared motivation, like we want to restore habitat in this particular segment of stream. They might bring different capacities, right? So biophysical scientists are going to know something different than social scientists. People that live there are going to know the site better than people who are just studying it. So all of these people work together to come up with some action that they're going to take to try to address an issue. And then based on that, there will be some types of consequences or outcomes that feed back into the system and influence the next steps, and we might have to adapt. So that's how I approach the research that I'm doing. All right, so I talked a little bit about how governance, these decision-making processes, shape socio-environmental outcomes. So a quick question for you all. Do we still have environmental challenges in the US? Yes. Heck yeah, we do. So if governance shapes socio-environmental outcomes, then how do we still have challenges? Not all governance is created equal. This results in a heterogeneous distribution of environmental and social outcomes, which basically means the outcomes that we see vary across space and time, right? Good example, this zooms into the city of Minneapolis. And so we find in Minneapolis, where we have a high percentage of people of color, we also have a higher overall temperature when compared to the citywide average, fewer acres of park, and a lower percentage of tree canopy cover. Okay, because of this, because of how the environment is designed, we then have negative impacts on the health and well-being of the people who live there. So why do we care about all this? So that example I just showed you is unequal distribution of benefits and burdens, right? So that was focused on burdens, but we could also think about a white, wealthy area that has a lot of tree canopy cover, but will get an unfair share of benefits. Diverse perspectives increase our understanding of systems. So again, if we have people that live in Minneapolis, they're going to know Minneapolis better than me, who lives in Duluth, going down to Minneapolis to study it. Next, representation is not enough in decision making. So there's a lot of research that starts to look at having a seat at the table is wonderful. But if that doesn't mean anything and you can't actually influence the decision, then you might as well not have a seat at the table. There's research showing that when community members are involved in decision making, if they feel like their thoughts and opinions are influencing that decision, even if the decision is against what they want, they'll be more accepting of it. Uncertainty over what mechanisms in what context lead to better social ecological outcomes. So same thing, we still have problems. So we don't know for sure what is going to connect A with B that's going to lead to this improved outcome that we want. And then finally, we need a need to focus on both informal and formal rules. So this sort of goes back to norms, as well as these more official formal rules that shape how decisions are made and what we find on the ground. And then just one that's not really based in theory, but we're also trying to be good people, even if it's hard, right? All right, so with that framing, I'm going to dive into some case studies. And I'm going to try to highlight 3 projects here, just to give you a taste of different areas of work that I'm working in. So 2 are around Minnesota and the Great Lakes, and then one's out in California that's a little bit older, but I wanted to give you a flavor for something that's not Midwest and that's specific to water. So I'm going to start with that one, which is California drinking water and climate adaptation. Oops. So how many of you have been to California? Have any of you studied California? No, okay. So California has a number of different climate impact regions. it is very, very diverse. When we look at the precipitation map, which is the center one, most of the water falls in the north, where we have the blue and the green. Well, most of the people are in the south. So it's a big problem. As a result, if you're interested in drinking water, California is a phenomenal system to study because it is a hot mess. This map begins to show the projects that are in place to try to move drinking water from the north to the south. There are two major projects. One is called the state project and one is the state and federal project. So there are these pink and orange that are the main systems that move water down. If we look at the type of systems that are owned in California, similar to other places, we find that very small and small drinking water systems, there are a ton of them, but they're serving a very small percentage of the population, right? On the other end, we see very few, very large and large systems that are serving most of the population. So with sort of that background, as a PhD student, I worked with a number of folks to study the 2012 to 2016 California drought. This was a historic drought at the time, a lot of problems. Research has primarily focused on larger systems because, rightly so, they serve most of the population. But what that does is leaves all of our huge number of very small and small systems out of the discussion. And so we were really interested in, do those smaller systems experience drought differently? And how do they plan for long-term climate change and adaptation needs? So this was a multi-year project, which is awesome. You don't always see this. You don't always have the time or the money to do a multi-year project, but the stars sort of aligned on this. So we started with a survey that went out to drinking water systems throughout the state of California. And using that data, which involved things like, how are you planning for drought now? What does your water portfolio look like? Are you dependent on groundwater or surface water? We use that survey to inform more in-depth interviews, which allows us to get more of the meat of the discussion, right? So we did all these interviews across the state. Then we used that information to inform 3 major regional workshops throughout California, where we brought together other systems and said, this is what we're hearing in the interviews. Is this similar to what you all have experienced? What are we missing? Finally, we used all of that to inform a state policy forum, where again, we brought drinking water systems into Sacramento along with policymakers and with nonprofits interested in equity and drinking water rights to discuss how the drought was going and what could be changed in the future. So this shows the data that we collected, all the systems that we talked to. One of the pluses of using these multi-methods is that you can get really good coverage across the state. So you might say, what about this part of the state? This is largely desert and there aren't really a lot of people there. So we then binned our systems, and the system group that we were really interested in is what's called S3 systems. So these are smaller systems that are not connected to one of those major water projects that I showed you on that first slide. So we identified impacts from the drought, we identified responses to the drought, and we identified barriers to drought management and long-term adaptation planning. For this talk, so that I can get through the other case studies, I'm just focusing on the barriers here. So the green bars are those S3 systems that we're interested in. The gold are the non-S3, so everybody else. So first, you might notice that there are similar length bars for some of these themes. Does that mean that they shared, for example, the same regulatory complaints? No. It means that all systems said there were regulatory barriers to long-term planning, but when we dig into the details of small versus other size systems, we find very different outcomes. For the small systems related to regulatory, the first point was that conservation mandate that California put out failed small systems. So California required curtailing the water that you were using and tracking the water that you were using, or you got fined if you went over whatever the limit was, which is great if you're a large system that has a really big budget and can afford to say, Screw the conservation mandate. My people can still afford it, so I'm going to keep giving them water. Small systems, on the other hand, can't deal with that. They're, on the one hand, having part of their department telling people not to be using drinking water, and on the other hand, part of their department saying, keep buying water, otherwise we won't have funding to update and improve our systems. The state also had some funding pots available, which was great, but they defined things like it has to be drought induced. Well, if you don't have the data, you have to pay to do the studies to try to collect the data, which if you're a small system, you already don't have enough money, so that's adding another barrier. The state also had defined terms for what counts as disadvantaged or overburdened. And again, we found a lot of systems that were right at the cusp, and so they could not get money because of that. Next, we've got communication, trust, and shared vision. So here, a lot of the themes when we talk about long-term planning related to board members who have a say in how the system is run. So we had system managers saying that their board members were climate deniers, and so they refused to think about the long term. We had system managers who said that the boards were focused on short term because they're getting reelected. So as soon as they're elected, they're focused on how can I get reelected? Well, I don't care about your great, great, great grandchild. I care about you. And then also a lack of community and system trust. So again, when we've got the system on the one hand saying, don't buy water and don't use it, and on the other hand saying, please keep buying it, the trust is eroded. And then physical resources, probably not a big surprise. Again, so there were some complaints about wasted resources on, quote, pipe dreams. So one system in specific was in a valley in Southern California, and their board pushed and pushed to spend a ton of money doing a study on consolidating, so connecting to the next closest system. But really, they already knew that that wasn't going to be realistic because it was going to be way too expensive. And that's exactly what the study found. And it took 10 years to do the study, a ton of money that could have been spent in other ways. Also, there were no resources for aging infrastructure. And then finally, lack of staff capacity to implement. So these very small systems, they really, they might have 1 or 2 staff members. So they're running the system, they're managing the budget, they're mowing the lawns and landscaping in their communities. They don't have time to be applying for funding or thinking about these other projects that need to be implemented. All right, so we took all that, we put it into this forum on drought resilience, and we found 3 main takeaways. So the first, that collaboration is key to reducing barriers to small systems. Again, maybe not a huge surprise, but we did dig into details like, okay, if there's multiple small systems in an area and none of them can singly afford some equipment, they can go in together and purchase a piece of equipment and share it. Potential of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, to address small system barriers. Has anyone heard of SGMA? SGMA is a relatively new act in California that's really trying to bring systems together that share a groundwater basin to provide more representation and community-informed groundwater management. We could have a whole class just on SGMA, which we will not do today. Unfortunately, this has not panned out the way that they had hoped at the time. And then finally, one-size-fits-all policies with one deadline exacerbate these barriers. So again, when we have a conservation mandate, if that conservation mandate has one deadline, it's really hard for small systems to meet it. So we did all this stuff. It was part of the California Fourth Climate Assessment, which was awesome. And we were really hoping that through the policy forum, we would have some impact on policy. And lo and behold, we finally did. So this SB 552, which just stands for Senate bill, came out basically requiring small systems to have a drought plan in the future. It also provided some funding around that with a related bill that gave money and gave technical support into creating those plans. There, of course, are other things that have come out since then, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill that also has impacts on this. So what's next? Doing a deeper dive into Southern California to look at climate adaptation in water poor regions. And then there's a couple other things going on. For example, this was done a while ago, but we'd love to study whether these policy changes have shifted or removed barriers, or we're just seeing sort of kicking the can down the road. All right. Now I'm going to change and move over to Great Lakes. So the first project I'm going to talk about is community engagement and well-being. And so this is a project that I did as part of my postdoc with Kristen Nelson and Forrest Fleischman, who are in the Forest Resources Department at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And this long-term ecological research program, or LTER, this is the framework for that system. It has a bunch of different universities pulled together studying social ecological systems, right? So we've got the nature layers and the social layers. And our team is really interested in the governance, policy, and practice that occurs across those systems. So in the Twin Cities, if you're not as familiar, the metro region has these 7 counties. And we can start to think about the different rules and practices that are in place that govern urban nature, right? And so this is not meant to be exhaustive. It's just an example. We can think about different levels of government, as well as the linkage with tribal government. We can think about the link between government and NGOs or businesses or residents or interest groups. And so we want to slowly tease apart these different relationships to understand how decisions are made around urban nature. This piece that I'm going to be presenting today looks at this relationship between municipal government and residents. So we set out with a hypothesis that changes in local policy on technical aspects of urban nature, so things like stormwater management, are made by those with high levels of expertise, while policies on less complex aspects of nature, say lawn management, are made based on values and shared experiences. So for this, we decided to pool existing text documents. So we pulled ordinances, which are local regulations that different cities have. And so we identified 32 cities in the region. We developed a code book to capture a variety of things, including decision-making processes and authority, justice and equity. We looked at enforcement mechanisms, types of nature. And then we coded the ordinances using a system called Atlas TI. So you just read through the ordinance, find an excerpt of text, highlight it, tag different codes to it. And then we use margin coding and thematic analysis, which essentially is looking through ordinances on a particular topic and looking for patterns or themes within those. So just to give a quick example, this is a Brooklyn Park excerpt that talks about keeping of animals that are a public nuisance. And so here it says, upon the receipt of a written complaint signed by the occupants of 2 or more neighboring properties, the animal control officer will blah, 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 blah. This is an example of group comments because there are multiple neighbors coming together to submit something. We've published this initial work this year. And so overall, we found about 10 mechanisms of civic engagement. Okay, so we were looking at how can people be involved in decision-making around these different types of nature. And so what stands out to you here? Public hearings, yes. So overwhelmingly, this teal bar is public hearings. So on the one hand, there are 10 mechanisms. That's great, right? People have the opportunity to either orally or in writing give feedback that can supposedly change decision-making. On the flip side, public hearings are the primary way that we do that. If anyone has ever done research in public hearings, these are perhaps the lowest bar of civic engagement that we could get because they're great in theory, right? And Minnesota requires them for a lot of processes, but they're often held in government buildings that aren't in the center of the community. They often require people to pre-register in order to speak. You're limited to, say, a minute of speaking time. You have to submit your comments ahead of time. There's no discussion in the actual hearing. It's just presenting and then leaving. So if someone stands up after you and says something against what you just said, you can't actually respond to it. Also, we have no idea whether what's said actually influences the final decision that's made. On the flip side, we also find farm animals are dominated by individual comments. So farm animals seem to be the type of nature that fits outside of this public hearing that has more actual influence from people on the ground. And there are a lot of reasons why that might be that tie back to sort of historical relationships between cities and animals. So animals add a lot of waste to city regions. They created a lot of health and illness. And because of that, some of the initial ordinances we had barred animals from being allowed in the city. From that, we then looked at where in the ordinances we're finding nature and civic engagement. And so we found overwhelmingly, so these gold bars, that for most of the types of nature, they're found within the zoning section of ordinances. Again, the alternative or the outlier is farm animals. So why does this matter? And why do we care that it's in the zoning section? So the zoning section of codes is informed by the comprehensive plan process. The comprehensive plan each city has that basically talks about their goals and their long-term vision for what's going to happen in their community. So that includes recommended ordinances that can be added to the zoning section. Why this is a problem is because remember we just talked about public hearings. In Minnesota, public hearings are one of the quintessential ways that comprehensive plans are formed and designed. That's how we get public input. So based on all of sort of the strict rules on comprehensive plan processes, who do you think is going to the public hearings? Any guesses? They're not going to be people with multiple jobs. It's not going to be people with young kids that don't have someone to watch them. It's not going to be people who have even normal scheduled one job, right? It's going to be typically white, wealthier individuals who are highly educated, who have the ability to go and say something. So if we have one slice of the population that is influencing zoning decisions and influencing the vision for a community, then what happens with the rest of that population? They then don't have a say, which means that everything in the future of that region is based on one slice of perspective. And so we have potentially huge issues here related to gentrification and other challenges that need to be addressed. And that fits back to the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens. All right, so based on that, we are analyzing the rest of the ordinances now to see if similar patterns emerge across more than a subset of, I think those 5 cities that we looked at to start. We're also looking to see how those rules vary across socio-demographics themselves. We are doing a subset of case study, like interview sets in 5 cities as well to get more in-depth input on how people advocate and actually have a say in nature. And then we're looking at a number of other things like city council meeting minutes and recordings to see how community is engaging, who is engaging, what input they're providing, and hopefully tying that eventually to does it influence the decision that's made. And so that we're hoping to use some more like natural language processing and things like Google API, because otherwise it takes just a ton of people hours to go through all of this and manually code it. All right, so that takes us to the last case study that I'm going to talk about today, which is also in the Great Lakes region around community engagement and well-being. And so this is some of the work that I'm doing at EPA now. So I've been here for just about a year. So this is sort of the least baked in the oven, I will say, at least from my involvement in it. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, right, is this binational agreement between the US and Canada. Its goal is to restore and protect the Great Lakes. Important goal. It's made up of articles and annexes, which basically outline objectives, who's in charge of what, and the annexes specifically look at issues like nutrients or aquatic invasive species. So EPA sort of coordinates the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement on the US side, but it's not done in a vacuum again, right? If we look at the Great Lakes system, we're talking about, sure, 2 countries, but a number of tribal governments, of Métis and First Nations. There are provincial agencies and state agencies. A number of states are involved. We're talking about, soil and water conservation districts, local governments, the International Joint Commission. We also have groups like public advisory councils or community advisory councils that all play some role in managing Great Lakes in some way. So under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, it identifies what are called areas of concern, or AOCs, very original name. And these AOCs are areas where there is significant impairment of beneficial uses as a result of human activities at the local level. So what does this mean? Basically, we're looking at biological, physical, and chemical impairments. Okay, so there was a paper that came out in 2006 that's referred to as the prescription paper. And this reflects that ecosystem approach and really, again, looks at human-induced stressors to these biological, physical, and chemical dimensions of the system. So biophysical is what we're focused on. An example, for those of you up here, you might be familiar with this already, the St. Louis River AOC and what we affectionately call Pickle Pond. The map all the way on the left shows the full AOC region, sorry, on the right. So the St. Louis AOC is the second largest of the AOCs. It involves 2 states. There are Superfund sites. It has important fish spawning habitat. It also has Spirit Lake, which is of cultural significance to the Fond du Lac, and a number of pollutants that projects have been aimed at trying to solve. So again, just giving you an example of what this looks like. And for us, it's right in our backyard. So the piece that stands out to me when I'm looking at this is people as the problem. So we can go back to the social ecological systems framework, right? And so if someone says to me, are people the problem? I would come back with, it's complicated, right? Because sure, right? People impact the environment. We know this. What we do has ramifications, has implications for water quality, for habitat. But these habitats, the ecosystem influences people as well. And people are also critical to managing these systems. And so something that's been pushed forward is the ecosystem-based approach, which I think of as a social ecological systems lens. It's very similar. So the idea is that we still recognize these biophysical dimensions, but we also need to incorporate people into that process and understand how these major environmental challenges and these restoration efforts that we're making in the areas of concern are going to influence people. So how do we do this? Well, so you're looking at a map of the AOCs on here, so you can see there's a large number of them. The pink stars are where we're currently doing some work. The outlined are areas that we're just starting some discussions on. And we can use a variety of methods to study the relationship between people and these ecosystems. So that involves things like literature reviews. So one of the things I'm working on now is trying to understand what are social indicators of environmental restoration. We have chemical and biophysical dimensions and indicators. What about social? Why don't we have that? So there have been some studies done both in the US and globally that try to capture and measure social indicators. We're doing things like surveys right now to understand how people are using the space, what they want to see change in these regions, in these green spaces, and also what their interest is or is not in long-term care and stewardship for the region. Also doing some textual analysis to understand, again, who's participating, how are they participating, and what are their main concerns. So just showing you some quick pictures of some of the other stuff we're doing. So again, this is Pickle Pond in Superior. We have trail counters out there now, so if you ever go out there, you might be counted. We have some trail cams as well. We do aesthetics and observation work to understand different people's perceptions of this space. Right now, much of that observation, or much of the aesthetics work, is done by EPA scientists, right? But we can think about expanding that to community members so that we can start to understand how do scientists and non-technical experts experience or perceive the same space? Does it vary? And what does that mean in terms of long-term stewardship? So one of the other sites on there is Cuyahoga Falls, another really interesting project because they're removing a dam. And that dam has 60 feet, so 30 feet of water and 30 feet of sediment behind it that all needs to be removed before that dam comes down. So I was just out here a couple of weeks ago, and historically it looks like this. So they're hoping that they'll still see waterfalls under it once the dam's removed. But this is going to likely have huge impacts on the communities that live there, right? So it's in sort of a chain of green spaces there. One of those is this space. This used to be covered in trees. The trees have been taken down, and they've been doing all this work to store the sediment that's going to be pulled out from behind the dam. So that's going to have huge impacts on people who used to be there and play sports in that green field, right? So these are the things that we need to start thinking about, how people are using this space, how they're accessing it, and what they want to see in the future. And then finally, this is Katie, I think she's on the call too. This is my coworker, Katie, who's been working at this much longer than me. And I should have taken the picture the other way so that you can see that there's an actual farmer's market going on and it's not just Katie and I set up here at a table. But we're also doing community engagement work to talk to people that are in this region. And Katie and I just did this, I think, last weekend, maybe the weekend before. And we had a number of people who didn't even know what Pickle Pond was. But the second we pointed to it, it's right over here, they're like, oh yeah, I know that space. So again, we're starting to see people not focused on these smaller segments, but on this more connected habitat and green space. This picture then on the right is at the US Steel site around Morgan Park. That's another area that we're hoping to start doing some of our research at. So what's next on this? Again, doing the literature review now on the social indicators of restoration. And really, we're trying to track over time how people's perceptions and values change in these spaces, both once restoration is done, but also before restoration starts, while it's happening, and once it's done. Because that can really inform our broader scope question of how do these social ecological systems change over time, and how do we actually get to improved social and environmental outcomes. We see a bunch of other stuff that we're talking about. So in summary, I think I'm just at 40 minutes. To create more equitable governance systems that result in improved socio-environmental outcomes, we need to understand the systems and how they vary across space and time. We need to understand what makes these systems more or less equitable and how we can implement more equitable systems. We need to understand what the ideal social and environmental outcomes are. Right? A lot of this is we just do, we see what happens, we adjust. We need to understand how we can reach the social and environmental outcomes that we decide are the ones that we're aiming for. And then finally, how can we maintain those outcomes over time, or likely have them be adaptive to changing circumstances over time, particularly as climate change becomes a bigger challenge that we're trying to face. So in short, when we talk about environmental policy or we talk about environmental restoration, I will now get off my soapbox by leaving you with, it's about so much more than meeting the biological, chemical, and physical criteria. If you are interested in any of this work, I'm happy to talk to you. There's a lot of other projects that I didn't mention today. We're also hoping to hire some techs for the summer to help with some of the data collection and analysis. And if you're in the Twin Cities, I'm also happy to put you in connection with the LTER governance teams there as well. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, so go for the question. Oh, Maya has a question.
Yeah.
What strategies have you found to be like helpful in communities that don't have as much of a voice because of the limitations in the way that like these forums are conducted? Like I know you said you do surveys. Like how do you like make sure that you're getting those?
Yeah, great question. So repeat it.
Question?
Yeah. So for folks in the Twin Cities, the question was, how do you ensure that you get engagement with the voices that you need to be as part of that conversation? That's the gist, right? So yeah, that's a great question. And I think some of that is still figuring out what works. One of the approaches that we're trying to do here, at least with the St. Louis AOC, is we've started identifying different events and key locations where community members are hanging out in Superior specifically. And so we're hoping next year to launch like a full-fledged, hey, let's just go hang out and talk to people at the grocery store or at a bar or wherever it is. Like that is a key piece of it, is getting to the people, because things like surveys are great. They give us quantitative data that we can throw into a model and say, look what we just did. But if we're only getting a slice of the population, that's a huge issue, right? So part of it is diversifying where we are and putting more time in, like going to farmers markets on weekends. Doesn't, like, people don't follow a 9-to-5 schedule. So we need to be adaptive to that. The other one, a big one, is building trust. And part of that is just starting to go out into the communities and volunteering or spending time in the space, getting to know the different interest groups and who these key people are in the communities. Because while we are considered sort of technical experts going out there, or social scientists that are trained in this, we're still not going to be ground zero hero for a neighborhood, right? It's likely that a lot of these different places have someone that they trust, that they talk to. And so making those relationships is super important, because partnering with these more on the ground groups, specifically in places where, we're doing research in Ohio, and I don't live in Ohio. So partnering with groups that already have these connections is super important. Great question. Yeah.
My question kind of builds off of Maya's. The first case study you talked about in California, I was looking at the numbers of how many people were interviewed, and I recognize that a lot of times people don't want to participate, but how do you account for the fact that you, like in that study, and I'm not saying you, but like the
Right.
team, how do you account for only interviewing 59 people when California has a much
Yes.
larger population?
Yes. I mean, that's a great question. So, sorry, for the Twin Cities people, if you didn't hear that, it was for the drinking water project specifically. We interviewed, how many was it? 59 people, and there's a massive population in California. So how do we rectify that if it's only representing a slice of the population? So yeah, part of that is using multiple methods, because what I didn't show here was a comparison about the systems that are covered through each one. So while we spoke through interviews with fewer people, we reached out to a much broader number in the regional workshops. So we specifically recruited people with local partners who we did not talk to either through interviews or surveys. So that's one way that you can do it. It's not going to be perfect. And part of it is, if we had more time and more money, right? The age-old two things that we need, we could spend, full time just running around to systems and talking to them. As it was, we do use snowball sampling when we're doing interviews. So if we talk to a super small system in the desert in Southern California, they might recommend someone that they know who used to live there but now runs a small system in Northern California in the middle of the woods. So it's sort of a combination of both of those, while recognizing that within the limitations of research funding and timing and everything else, you can only do what you can do. So what you do with that is what's more important. That's a great question, though.
Any question from Twin City? Maybe you can unshare the screen.
Yeah, no, we wanted to know more in the MSP study you presented. It seemed like any regulation or any behavior regarding farm animals as an entity seemed like an outlier compared to any of the other ordinance types you looked at, and just wanted to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so a lot of the farm animal work, and I thought I put a bunch of extra slides in here, but I don't think I actually have another one on the farm animals. Yeah. So historically, I mentioned that cities used ordinances to keep animals out of city centers or urban areas. And so a lot of that was to deal with waste, to deal with illness, et cetera, and contamination of water. But now we are seeing a shift in maybe the last 5-10 years that really looks at communities wanting to reintroduce farm animals to urban areas as a second source of income or a second source of food, right? And so it's possible that over time, like one of the things that we sort of hypothesized is that we might eventually see farm animal ordinances showing up in the zoning section, which is maybe not great, right? So because it's still relatively new, and there have been some good studies in recent years, particularly around poultry ordinances by Catherine Brinkley, that look at the reintroduction of these farm animal ordinances. But I will say, like Brooklyn Park, they overwhelmingly, they had the community vote that they wanted a chicken ordinance that allowed chickens in their neighborhoods, but the city council turned it down. And I haven't dug further into that, but this is part of the problem with, like, if people can have a seat at the table, but it doesn't actually matter what they say, then maybe we shouldn't invite them to the table in the first place and just accept the way we are. But yeah, that's one of the main things, is that the farm animal ordinances are still relatively new. And so, you know, in Minnesota, you can go back through like historic state ordinances and actually see where it was removed and hasn't been reintroduced. So yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Any other questions? Oh, okay. Well, let's thank you to our speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think next week, I think it is speakers from the Twin City, I believe. Diana, do you want to talk?
Oh, no, I was going to say next week is the Minnesota Water Resources Conference, right? So we're not having this seminar on Monday.
Yep. All right, sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going down. All right. Good to see you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.